A mother bleeds in a frozen forest, her child trembles, and a rider emerges from the dark. Is he their savior, or the start of something sinister? You won't see the end coming. The wind tore through the trees like a wild beast let loose, howling across the open plains, kicking up clouds of dust and dry, crackling leaves. It whipped at the torn buckskin hanging loose over Rena's thin shoulders, tugging like it wanted to rip it away. Blood dripped slow and steady down her inner thigh, warm and sticky against her cold, bronzed skin. She leaned hard against a gnarled oak tree, its bark rough and half dead, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. With her body, she shielded her little girl from the biting wind. The child whimpered soft and low, her small, dirt-streaked hands clutching tight to Rena's waist, her wide eyes darting, fear, confusion, and a deep, quiet surrender pooling in them, a look too heavy for 5 years old. "They left us," Rena whispered, her voice so faint it blended into the wind's roar. She wasn't speaking to her daughter, not really. Her words drifted up to the gray sky, out to the swaying trees, to the spirits she was certain had turned their backs on her long ago. Her tribe, the Comanche, had called her cursed, a shadow on their name. They didn't cast out their own without cause, but here she was, alone, forsaken, stumbling through the wilderness. Why had they done it? Whispers had started it, dreams of dark omens, strange signs in the stars, mutterings of bad luck. She dared to carry life in her belly during a brutal season of war and death, when blood stained the earth and hope was a forgotten thing. Her husband had died horribly, an arrow piercing his throat, his body crumpling in the dirt, his last glassy-eyed stare fixed on her like she'd called the arrow herself. She'd survived when so many hadn't, and the tribe needed someone to blame for their losses. Her belly swelled now, huge and heavy, the baby inside kicking hard, ready to come any day. Pain rolled through her in sharp, merciless waves, each one crashing like a storm against a sinking boat. She gritted her teeth, swallowing her cries, desperate to keep her daughter from breaking under the weight of her fear. The little girl, her dark eyes wide and her face smudged with grime, stared up at her mother in silence, too still, too quiet for a child so young. "I'm sorry," Rena murmured, her trembling hand brushing a strand of tangled wind-whipped hair from Kaya's face. "We won't die here. I won't let us." Her voice was firm, a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The wind answered with a cruel, empty howl, mocking her defiance. They'd been walking for 2 long days, 2 endless stretches of hunger and cold, no food to fill their bellies, no shelter to rest in. They'd stumbled through sparse woods where the trees stood thin and bare, crossed icy creeks that numbed their legs, their breaths puffing white in the air. Early spring had come, but it brought no warmth, no mercy, just a faint green tease beneath a blanket of frost. Rena's moccasins had split open miles back, the soles flapping uselessly, her feet now raw and bloody, every step a fresh test of her will. Kaya, light as a feather, had grown too weak to carry, her small legs wobbling with each move. And now, the contractions hit, fast and fierce, tightening her belly like a fist. Her body had betrayed her, choosing this frozen, hopeless moment to force new life into a world that seemed to want them all dead. She slid down the tree slow, her legs giving out beneath her, a gasp escaping her cracked lips. The rough bark scraped her back as she sank, her hands clutching the trunk for balance. Kaya knelt beside her quick, pressing tiny, cold hands to Rena's flushed cheek. "Mother?" Kaya asked, her voice small and shaky, laced with broken English she'd picked up from traders who'd passed through their camp years ago. Rena blinked at her, the word piercing through the fog of pain. "Mother," it felt fragile, like a thread stretched too thin, ready to snap with death circling so close. A rustle snapped through the trees, sharp, sudden. Rena's head jerked up. Was it a rabbit darting away? A wolf stalking close? Or something worse, something human, hunting them down? Her hand tightened around Kaya, pulling her in, while her other hand fumbled to the small flint knife strapped to her leg. The blade was dull, chipped, barely able to cut through soft wood, but it was all she had left, a final desperate claw against the dark. Night crept in slow and heavy, the sky bruising into deep purple and gray, streaked like a wound. The air grew colder, biting at her skin, sinking into her bones. She knew what happened to women who gave birth out here, far from the warm lodges of her people, far from the chance of midwives and the smell of burning herbs. Even with help, it could end in blood and silence. Out here, alone, the cold would sap her strength, infection would fester in her wounds, and Kaya would be left defenseless, a tiny figure against a vast, uncaring wild. That thought stabbed deeper than the pain ripping through her belly, sharper than any blade. She tilted her head back against the tree, whispering a prayer, not to the gods her tribe once honored, but to the dirt beneath her, the wind around her, anything that might hear. "Let her live," she breathed. "Take me if you must, but let her live." The wind screamed back, louder now, and this time, it carried something else. A low thudding, steady and growing, hooves on the frozen ground. Rena froze, her heart hammering so hard it drowned out the wind. Kaya's grip tightened, her small nails digging into Rena's arm, her eyes wide with terror. A shadow flickered through the trees, then another, until a figure took shape. A man on horseback, cloaked in a long weathered coat, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, hiding his eyes in shadow. A rifle lay across his lap, its barrel catching the last faint light of dusk. He wasn't Comanche, his pale skin gleamed under the dirt, his beard rough and unkempt. He reined his horse to a stop, just far enough to keep them from bolting, and stared down at them. His gaze moved slow, over Rena, slumped and bleeding, over Kaya huddled against her, over the blood pooling in the dirt, over the trembling knife in her hand. He didn't move. Neither did she. The air stretched tight between them. Would he speak? Would he raise that rifle? Was he help, or the end? For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, slow and deliberate, he swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching the frost. His horse snorted, tossing its head, pawing the ground like it smelled the tension thick in the air. He held his hands out to his sides, palms up, showing they were empty, no weapon drawn, no threat yet. "I ain't here to hurt you," he said, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. Rena's fingers tightened on the knife, her breath shallow and fast, pain slicing through her belly again, sharper now. He took a cautious step closer, his eyes flicking from her face to Kaya, then down to the blood staining her legs. "You'll die out here," he said, flat and honest, no sugar in his words. "Both of you." She didn't answer, just stared, her silence a wall between them. He took another step, boots crunching louder. "You need help," he said. "I've got a cabin not far, fire, food, a bed. You won't make it through the night out here." She shook her head once, quick and desperate, a reflex of distrust. "I'm not the enemy," he said, kneeling down 6 feet away, hands still out, his voice softening just a touch. "Not here to hurt women or kids. I was hunting deer, found you instead." Kaya peeked up at him, then back at her mother, her small body trembling. Rena's strength was slipping away, the pain surged, her vision blurred, the knife slipped from her fingers and thudded soft into the dirt. Her eyes rolled back, her body slumped sideways against the tree, and darkness swallowed her whole. He moved fast then, lunging forward to catch her before her head cracked against the roots. She was heavier than she looked, worn thin by hunger, swollen with child, slick with blood, but he lifted her with steady hands. He turned to Kaya, who stared at him like a cornered fox, ready to bolt. "She yours?" he asked. She nodded, slow and wary. "Can you walk?" Another nod, her eyes never leaving his face. "Good. Stay close." He hoisted Rena over the saddle, gentle as he could, draping her limp form across the horse's back. She groaned faintly, then went still again, her belly hard and tight beneath the blood-soaked leather. The baby was coming, too fast, too soon. "Name?" he asked Kaya, his tone clipped but calm. She hesitated, then whispered, "Kaya." "I'm Cole Tanner," he said. "Come on, Kaya. We'll get her warm." He took the reins, leading the horse into the trees, Kaya trailing close behind. The forest swallowed them whole, branches snapping shut like jaws. Night pressed in deeper, the wind howling far behind, but a faint rustle lingered, too soft to be the breeze. Something else was out there, watching them go. The journey to the cabin stretched long and tense. the horse's hooves thudding a steady rhythm against the uneven ground. Cole kept his eyes forward, scanning the shadows, one hand on the reins, the other resting near his rifle. Kaya stayed silent, her small steps crunching behind him, her breath puffing white in the cold. The woods were thick here, pines and bare oaks tangling overhead, blocking out the stars. Every snap of a twig, every flutter of leaves made Cole's shoulders tighten. Was it just the wind, or were they being followed? He didn't look back, didn't dare slow. Rena's faint moans cut through the quiet now and then, her body shifting against the saddle, the blood dripping slow and steady onto the frost below. Time dragged. How far was this cabin? Was it even real, or was he leading them into a trap? Finally, as full dark settled in, a shape loomed ahead, a squat log cabin nestled tight between two low hills, its outline barely visible against the night. Smoke curled thin from a crooked chimney, a faint promise of warmth. Cole kicked the door open with his boot, the wood creaking loud in the silence, and carried Rena inside. He laid her down on a narrow cot near the hearth, her body limp and pale against the rough blanket. The fire was low, just a flicker of coals. He tossed on split logs, coaxing it back to life with quick, practiced hands. Flames leapt up, casting jagged shadows across the room. He grabbed a worn wool blanket from a trunk and tucked it around her. She shivered hard, her teeth chattering, blood soaking through her leggings now in a dark, spreading stain. The contractions were close, too close. Her body wouldn't wait. "Kaya," he said, turning to the girl who stood stiff and small by the hearth, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "Get water from the barrel outside. Quick." She nodded and slipped out, her footsteps fading fast into the night. Cole scrubbed his hands in a basin of cold water, his fingers trembling, not from the chill, but from memory. He hadn't helped birth a child since his own, a daughter, born still and silent years back, her mother gone soon after to fever. He hadn't touched a woman since, hadn't let himself feel anything close to this. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, grabbing a knife from the table and slicing strips from a clean shirt he pulled from a shelf. He knelt by Rena, working fast, talking low to keep her steady. "You're not dying here, lady. I won't let you." Rena groaned, her eyes fluttering open for a split second, pain twisting her face into a mask of agony. "Breathe," he said, firm but soft. "Stay with me. You're tougher than this storm." Kaya darted back in, a sloshing bucket clutched in her small hands. Cole dipped a cloth into the water, wiped the blood and sweat from Rena's legs as best he could. She cried out then, a raw, broken sound. The baby was coming, no stopping it now. Time blurred into a haze of heat, blood, and her screams echoing off the log walls. Cole moved on instinct, hands shaking, heart pounding, no room for doubt. Then, a sharp, shrill cry sliced through the chaos. A girl, tiny and red, kicking against the world. He wrapped her quick in a strip of wool, her wails filling the cabin, and handed her to Kaya. Kaya's eyes widened, all washing over her as she cradled Suna, holding her like she might break. Cole slumped back against the wall, blood smeared up his arms, his shirt soaked with sweat and streaks of red. Rena's chest rose and fell, shallow, weak, but alive. He dropped to the floor beside the cot, staring into the fire's glow, its crackle the only sound beyond Suna's soft whimpers. "What the hell did I just step into?" he muttered, running a hand over his unshaven jaw. Kaya didn't answer, just sat cross-legged by the hearth, rocking Suna gently, her dark eyes flicking between her mother and the flames. Outside, the wind quieted, but a faint crunch of frost echoed beyond the walls, too deliberate to be nothing. Something was still out there, circling closer. What had he dragged into his lonely cabin? And what was waiting in the dark to claim it? Morning crept in slow, dragging pale gray light through a thick shroud of fog that clung low to the earth. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, smoke curling lazy in the air, filling the cabin with a woody haze. Cole sat slumped on a wooden stool, elbows on his knees, his hands still crusted with dried blood and sweat. He hadn't slept, hadn't dared close his eyes. Rena lay pale and still on the cot, wrapped in every blanket he could find, her skin damp with fever, her breathing faint and uneven. Suna slept swaddled tight in Kaya's arms. Kaya hadn't moved all night, Her small body curled protectively around her sister, her gaze old beyond her years, like she'd seen too much death already. That look struck Cole deep, a mirror to his own past. When fever stole his family, when the world went quiet and cold, leaving him nothing but echoes. He stood slow, joints popping loud in the stillness, and shuffled to the hearth. Kaya flinched, her shoulders hunching. "Just putting on water," he said, voice gentle as he could make it. She relaxed a fraction, her eyes tracking him warily. He stoked the coals with a poker, added kindling, and watched the flames snap back to life, their heat cutting through the morning chill. He poured water from a chipped jug into a tin pot and set it over the fire, the soft hiss of it filling the quiet. Minutes ticked by, slow and heavy. Rena stirred then, a sharp gasp breaking from her lips, her hand reaching out blind before her eyes even opened. Cole crossed the room quick, crouching beside the cot. "You're all right," he said, soft but steady. "You're safe." Her eyes snapped open, wild and searching, darting around the dim cabin, over the rough log walls, the flickering fire, the small figure of Kaya by the hearth. They landed on Suna, then Kaya, and relief flooded her face, easing the lines of pain for a moment. Then her gaze found Cole, hard and untrusting, piercing through him like a blade. "I'm Cole Tanner," he said, meeting her stare, sensing the questions she didn't voice. "Found you out in the trees. You were, well, you wouldn't have made it through the night." "You delivered her?" she asked, her voice hoarse and broken, barely above a whisper. He nodded once, simple. "Did what I could." She reached for Suna, her arm trembling with the effort. Kaya shuffled over, gentle as a breeze, and passed the tiny bundle into her mother's arms. Rena cradled her close, her cracked lips moving in a soft melodic murmur, words Cole didn't know, maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. "She all right?" he asked, his voice low. "Strong," Rena said, her eyes on Suna's small, scrunched face. "Like her sister." Cole glanced at Kaya, who sat taller now, a flicker of pride lighting her tired eyes. "She's got your fight," he said, a faint trace of a smile tugging at his mouth. Rena's gaze sharpened, cutting back to him. "Why help us?" The question hung heavy, fair and loaded. He didn't have a clean answer, just a raw one that scraped its way out. "Someone should've," he said after a long pause, his voice rougher than he meant it. "That's all." She didn't reply, just held Suna tighter, her fingers curling into the wool. "You can leave when you're strong enough," he added, shifting his weight. "I ain't keeping you here." "And go where?" she said, her tone bitter, edged with a quiet fury. "My people hunt me. Yours fear me." He looked away, staring at the fire. He knew that feeling, that nowhere ache, too well. "Stay then," he said, almost too quiet to hear. "Long as you need." She didn't agree, didn't refuse, just watched him, her silence louder than words. By midday, Rena had strength enough to sit up, her back braced against the log wall, Suna nestled against her chest. Cole cooked broth, dried venison and knobby roots tossed into a pot, and set a steaming bowl beside her. She took it without a word, sipped slow, wincing as the heat hit her cracked lips, but drank it all, hunger outweighing pride. Kaya moved close, curling up beside her mother, resting her head gentle on Rena's shoulder. Rena's hand found Kaya's hair, fingers tangling in it with a quiet, fierce affection. Cole watched from across the room, something stirring deep in his chest. Memory, maybe, or a longing he'd buried long ago. He turned away quick, busying himself with cleaning the small space. The cabin was simple. One main room, a cot shoved against the wall, a scarred table with 2 chairs, a hearth in the center, shelves stacked with tools, canned goods, odds and ends. He'd built it with his own hands years back, after riding west to outrun a war that took too many, a past that left him hollow. It had been enough, solitary, silent, until now. That night, he spread a straw-stuffed mattress near the hearth, covering it with thick blankets. "Sleep there," he said, gesturing. "It's warmer." "I'll sleep here," Rena said, her voice even, unyielding. He didn't argue, just nodded and stepped outside, letting the door thud shut behind him. The air outside was crisp, sharp as a blade, the stars overhead bright and cold, staring down like they were judging him. He lit his pipe, the smoke curling up into the dark, and leaned against the porch railing. Inside, Rena lay down slow, every movement stiff with pain, her girls curling beside her, Suna tucked between them, Kaya's arm draped protective over her sister. She stared up at the roof beams, listening to the fire crackle, feeling its warmth soak into her aching bones. She remembered the cold, the dark, the edge of death under that tree. She remembered Cole's hands, rough, trembling, but careful, pulling her back from the brink. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she didn't fear him either. Sleep came light, fractured by every creak of the logs, every shift of the wind. At one point, she saw him slip back in, adding wood to the fire, his shadow long and quiet against the wall. Neither spoke. The silence said enough. The next morning, Rena was stronger, up on her feet, walking a few shaky steps across the room with Kaya's small hands steadying her. Cole offered her fresh bread, a smear of jam from a jar he'd kept stashed away. She ate without comment, tearing off pieces for Kaya, her movements slow but sure. "Your daughter's smart," he said at one point, breaking the quiet. "Quiet. Got good sense." Rena nodded, her eyes on Kaya. "She survived. That makes her wise." The words landed heavy on Cole, a weight he felt in his gut. He crouched down beside Kaya, holding out a small wooden bear he'd whittled from pine, rough but solid. "Here," he said. "Something to hold." She looked at Rena, waiting. Rena gave a slight nod. Kaya took it, her fingers brushing the wood like it might vanish, then whispered, "Thank you," so soft he barely heard it. A tiny smile flickered on her face, the first he'd seen. That evening, as stew bubbled over the fire, the air thick with the smell of meat and smoke, Rena spoke without looking at him. "My husband died in a raid, arrows and blood, gone in a breath. My people blamed me, said I carried death inside me. Told me to leave or be left to rot. So I left." Her voice was steady, but the pain beneath it cut deep. Cole stirred the pot, the spoon scraping slow against the iron. He didn't answer right away, just let the silence sit. "I had a wife," he said finally, his words rough and slow. "A son. Fever took them both, fast and cruel. I left too. Didn't know where else to go." The fire snapped, the stew simmered, the only sounds for a long stretch. "This place is quiet," she said, her eyes on the flames. "Lonely," he admitted, his voice dropping low. "But I reckon it doesn't have to be." She didn't respond, but she didn't turn away either. Her gaze lingered, searching, like she was weighing him against the world she'd known. Days bled into weeks, slow and steady. The snow melted patchy and reluctant, spring creeping over the land with shy bursts of green and soft, warm breezes. They planted seeds in the soil behind the cabin, small rows of hope scratched into the dirt. Cole hammered together a second room, the thwack of his axe echoing through the hollow. Kaya roamed the edges of the clearing, gathering wildflowers, yellow and purple blooms she clutched like treasures, and pored over faded books Cole kept in a dusty chest, tracing words with her finger. Rena hunted with him some days, her steps growing surer, her laugh slipping out rare and sharp when he tripped over a root or missed a shot. Suna grew fast, her cries loud and fierce, full of life, her small fists punching the air. The cabin started to feel less like a hiding place and more like something alive, something theirs. But the woods didn't sleep. One morning, Cole came back from checking his traps, his face drawn tight, his boots caked with mud. He stood in the doorway, rifle slung over his shoulder, and met Rena's eyes. "Boot prints," he said, voice low and clipped. "North side of the ridge. 3 sets, maybe 4. Not ours. Too close to be passing through." Rena stiffened, her hand resting on Suna cradled against her chest. "Who?" she asked, her tone flat but her eyes sharp. "Could be hunters," he said, setting the rifle against the wall. "Could be worse. They're watching, hiding in the tree line." Kaya looked up from her flowers, her small hands pausing, sensing the shift. That night, Cole sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, the moon hanging full and watchful, silvering the leaves. Rena stepped out quiet, arms wrapped around herself, and sat beside him on the rough bench. They listened to the forest, crickets chirping, wind rustling, then a twig snapped, sharp and close. Cole's hand tightened on the gun. "They'll find us?" she asked, her voice steady, no tremble in it. "Then we fight," he said, his jaw set. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the dark beyond the clearing. "I won't let them take my girls." He glanced at her, the curve of her face lit faint by moonlight, her eyes burning with a fire that matched his own. "You shoot?" he asked. She gave a faint, dry smirk. "Not well. But I've got good aim with a blade." He chuckled low, the sound rough but real. "That'll do just fine." Next morning, he set a rifle in her hands. She held it awkward at first, the weight unfamiliar, but she listened as he showed her how to brace it, how to aim, how to breathe out slow before pulling the trigger. Her first shot went wide, kicking up dirt. The second clipped a branch. The third, crack, shattered a bottle he'd set on a stump, glass raining down. She lowered the gun, a flicker of pride in her eyes. Cole handed Kaya a slingshot he'd rigged from twine and a forked stick. She took to it fast, sending pebbles zipping through the air with eerie precision. One whizzed past his ear, nearly knocking his hat off. "Remind me not to get on your bad side," he said, raising a brow. Rena laughed, a short, bright sound that felt strange on her tongue but warmed the air. Kaya grinned, small but real. But the lightness faded quick. That afternoon, Cole hiked back to the ridge alone, his rifle slung low, his steps quiet on the pine needles. The boot prints were clearer now. 3 men, maybe 4, heavy boots with deep treads, one dragging a foot like an old wound slowed him. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Someone had been here, circling, waiting. He knelt by a track, frowning. The tread looked familiar, military issue, or close to it, something he hadn't seen since the war. A chill crawled up his spine. Then, a branch snapped behind him, loud and deliberate. He spun, rifle up in a heartbeat, his breath catching. A figure stepped out from the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a patched wool coat, a thick beard framing a smug, crooked grin. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice slow and taunting. "Cole Tanner. Ain't this something?" Cole's blood ran cold. Voss Harker, bounty hunter, ex-soldier, a man he'd fought beside once, years back, until Voss turned killer, murdered a marshal, and vanished into the hills. Cole had figured him dead, picked apart by wolves or time. "Didn't think you'd hole up with a squaw and 2 little ones," Voss said, nodding toward the faint curl of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. "Real cozy setup you got." Cole's finger hovered near the trigger, his voice low and hard. "Turn around, Voss. You've got 3 seconds." Voss spread his hands wide, mocking, his grin stretching wider. "Easy now, Tanner. I got no quarrel with you. Word's out. $50 bounty on a Comanche woman and her kid. Seen north of the pass. Tribal folks want her dead, whites want her caught. Either way, someone's paying, and where there's gold, I'm there." 2 more figures slipped out from the trees. A wiry man with a scar down his cheek, Clem Vance, rifle slung loose over his shoulder, and another, stocky and silent, Hank Bragg, eyes glinting under a low hat. They fanned out slow, flanking Voss, their steps quiet but sure. A third lingered in the shadows, Rye Flint, his limp marking him clear. "You think I'd sell her?" Cole growled, his grip tightening. Voss tilted his head, his grin turning sharp. "Didn't figure you for the sentimental type, but I've been wrong before." Cole backed off a step, his boots crunching gravel. "Come near my cabin, you won't leave upright." Voss laughed, low and mean. "We'll see about that, Tanner. We'll see." The men melted back into the trees, shadows swallowing them, but their threat hung heavy in the air, a promise of blood to come. Cole raced back to the cabin, his pulse thundering in his ears. He barred the door with a thick plank, his hand steady despite the shake. Rena stood alert, Suna in her arms, Kaya clutching her doll tight by her side. "They're coming," he said, simple and grim. 3, maybe more. Rena nodded once, her eyes like steel. "We fight," she said, her voice a quiet vow. They moved fast. Cole loaded both rifles, stashed knives in easy reach, checked the windows. Rena set a pot of water boiling on the stove, an old trick, but a scalding one. Kaya carried bullets in her small hands, trembling but steady, her face set with a grit beyond her years. Fear had no place here now, only survival. Dusk fell slow, the forest sinking into an eerie stillness, the kind that presses down before a storm. A whistle cut through the quiet, high, mocking. Cole stood by the window, rifle raised, peering through a crack in the shutters. "Come on out, Tana." Vasa's voice drifted through the trees, taunting. "Let's not make this messy." Rena pressed her back to the wall, her knife in one hand, Suna cradled close with the other. Kaya crouched under the table, Suna's basket beside her, her slingshot clutched tight. Cole didn't answer, just waited, his breath slow, his finger resting light on the trigger. A shot rang out, wood splintered near the doorframe, spraying shards across the floor. Cole fired back, the crack of his rifle splitting the air, shattering a tree trunk where Voss had ducked. Screams echoed, return fire lit up the clearing, bullets thudding into the logs. Chaos erupted. A window shattered, glass raining down. Rena grabbed the boiling water and hurled it through the gap. A howl followed, raw and pained, as Rye Flint stumbled back, clawing at his scalded face. Cole ducked, fired again, caught a leg, dropping Hank Bragg behind a bush with a shriek. Then, the door burst open, wood cracking under a heavy boot. Clem Vance stormed in, gun raised, his scarred face twisted in fury. Kaya screamed, Rena lunged, her knife flashing, driving it deep into his side. He staggered, blood blooming dark, his gun clattering to the floor. Cole spun, fired. A clean shot to the chest sent him crumpling lifeless to the ground. One down. Outside, the rest scattered, shouts turning to curses, footsteps fading fast. "You're dead, Tanner," Voss roared from the dark. "You and your damn red woman." Another wild shot cracked, then, silence, thick and heavy. They waited, breathless. 10 minutes, 20, 30. Nothing. "They're gone," Cole said finally, lowering his rifle, his voice tight. Rena sagged against the wall, her breath ragged, Kaya burying her face in her mother's side. Suna wailed, then quieted as Rena pressed her close. Cole scanned the room, blood stained the floor, the door hung crooked on broken hinges, smoke mingled with the sharp tang of gunpowder. "They'll be back," Rena said, her voice low, certain. He nodded, his face grim. "Not if we find them first." Her eyes met his. No fear, only fire. "I won't run," she said. "You won't have to," he replied. Outside, the trees stood dark and silent, but something lingered, unseen, its shadow stretching long into the night. Morning dawned red and angry, a sharp wind hissing through the hollow, dragging the scent of blood and violence from the splintered cabin door. Cole patched it with rough boards scavenged from an old crate, his knuckles split and crusted, every muscle aching from the fight. Rena stepped into the light beside him, her rifle slung across her back, Suna strapped tight to her chest, a knife at her waist. She moved slower, still healing, but her eyes burned with a hard, clear resolve. She'd bled here, fought here. This place was hers now too. "They won't stop," she said, not asking, just knowing. "No," Cole said, hammering a nail with a sharp thud. "Not unless we stop them first." She shifted Suna to her other hip, her gaze sweeping the tree line. "Then we go," she said. "Before nightfall." The plan came together sharp and fast. Cole knew the land, every ridge, every hollow, mapped in his mind from years of wandering alone. There was a rocky outcrop 3 ridges west, a narrow pass hemmed by boulders, a natural trap. If Voss and his men were hunting, they'd come through there, cocky, thinking they held the advantage. Cole had ambushed men in that pass before, he'd do it again. By mid-morning, they were packed and moving. Kaya clutched her doll and a small bundle of dried meat, her face pale but dry. No tears, no words, just quiet steps between her mother and Cole. Rena walked with calm purpose, Suna tied close, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was already tracking prey. Cole led, rifle in hand, his coat flapping in the wind, hat pulled low. They left the cabin behind without a backward glance, its smoke fading into the sky. The trail twisted long and slow through frozen underbrush and deer paths choked with thorns. The air hung heavy, the forest too quiet. No birds, no rustle, just their breaths and the crunch of boots on frost. Cole kept them moving, his eyes darting to every shadow, every sway of a branch. Was Voss watching already? Had he circled back? Hours stretched. Rena's steps grew heavier, her face tight with pain she didn't voice. Kaya stayed close, her slingshot tucked in her belt, her small hands clenched. The ridge loomed ahead by late afternoon, its jagged rocks cutting sharp against the gray sky. They stopped, Cole crouching behind a craggy boulder, peering down into the pass below. Rena set Suna in a nest of furs between two stones, Kaya curling beside her, arms wrapped protective around her sister. Cole and Rena took positions, him on the left flank, her on the right, rifles loaded, breath slow and deep. They waited, the silence pressing down like a weight. What if Voss didn't come? What if he'd brought more men? Then the woods stirred. Voices drifted up, low and careless, footsteps crunching closer. Voss's drawl cut through, loud and smug. "Found the cabin empty, Tanner," he called, laughing. "Thought you'd run, but I know you better than that." Cole didn't move, didn't blink. Voss stepped into the clearing below, 3 men at his back, rifles loose in their hands, eyes sweeping the rocks. Hank Bragg spat into the dirt, grinning. "Give you one more chance, Tanner." Voss shouted. "Turn over the woman. You walk away." Rena rose slow from her perch, her rifle steady. Crack! The shot split the air, dropping rye flint beside Voss, blood spraying across the snow. Cole fired a heartbeat later. Hank Bragg spun, clutching his chest, and fell into the brush. Panic erupted. Voss dove for cover, screaming orders, his voice shrill with rage. Clem Vance fired blind, his shot pinging off a rock near Cole. Bullets flew wild. Rena ducked, reloaded, her hands steady despite the chaos. Cole emerged from his boulder, boots sliding on gravel, and fired again. Clem dropped, a clean hit to the leg, his scream echoing before he went still. Only Voss remained, backed against a pine, his rifle shaking in his hands, his breath heaving. "Tanner!" he shouted, voice cracking. "You can't protect her forever." Cole stepped into the open, rifle leveled, cold fury burning in his eyes. "You don't get to say her name," he said, his voice ice. Voss fired first, a desperate shot. Cole felt the heat as it grazed his coat, tearing the fabric. He didn't flinch, his fingers squeezed, the crack of his rifle sharp and final. Voss's body jerked, his gun slipping from his hands as he crumpled into the snow, blood blooming dark beneath him. Silence fell, a terrible, heavy silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the pass. Rena stood at the ridge's edge, her rifle lowered slow, her breath misting in the cold. "Over?" she asked, her voice steady but searching. Cole stared at Voss's body, the past bleeding out with him, a weight he hadn't known he carried easing just a fraction. "For now," he said, his tone grim. They trudged back to the cabin as dusk settled, the sky bruising purple and gold. The cabin stood waiting, smoke curling faint from the chimney, the door patched and sturdy again. That night, they sat around the fire, Suna cooing soft, Kaya nestled between them with her doll tucked under her chin. The room glowed warm, amber light dancing on the walls. Snow began to fall outside, slow spirals catching the fire's reflection. Rena watched the flames, her fingers brushing Suna's cheek. "I thought I was dead," she said quiet. "Under that tree, I thought I was gone." Cole stirred the fire, the poker scraping soft. "I thought I was done, with people, with kindness. Thought the world had no place left for it." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "You saved us." He met her gaze, unflinching. "You saved me back." They sat in silence, the weight of it settling between them. Then Kaya's voice piped up, small and hesitant. "Can we stay here forever?" Cole glanced at Rena. She looked back, a flicker of something soft in her eyes. "Reckon we can," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. Suna sneezed, a tiny, sharp sound, and they all laughed, the room filling with a warmth that felt rare, whole, unbreakable. But the peace wasn't solid. Weeks passed, snow melted fully, spring bloomed bright with wildflowers and birdsong. They built a bigger life. Cole added a porch, Rena hunted deeper into the woods, Kaya learned to read by the firelight. Suna grew strong, her cries fierce and full of fight. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Cole stepped outside to chop wood, his axe biting deep into a log. A sound stopped him cold, a low, human howl, too close, echoing from the trees. He grabbed his rifle, his pulse kicking hard. Rena appeared beside him, knife in hand, her face set. "More," she whispered. "Maybe," he said, scanning the dark. "Ready?" She nodded, her grip tightening. The next morning, he found tracks, fresh, deep, circling the cabin. Not Voss's men. Someone new, someone careful. That night, a shadow flickered past the window, gone before he could aim. Rena stood watch with him, the girls asleep inside. "They won't stop," she said, her voice steel. "Then we don't either," he replied. The forest held its breath, but whatever was out there wasn't finished. It was waiting, watching, biding its time. This story's far from over. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us, who's stalking the hollow now? Your voice keeps this tale alive, just like their fight.